Hi, everyone. Welcome to this seminar. We'll wait just 1 minute for the participants to come in. Okay, welcome everyone. This is the Injury and Violence Prevention Center's monthly Research to Practice seminar. I'm happy to welcome you here today. The title of our talk is Promoting Voluntary Out-of-Home Firearm Storage to Prevent Suicide, the Role of Storage Maps and Community Partners. And before I introduce our 4 speakers today and thank them for coming, I do want to let you know, if this is your first time joining, this is a monthly seminar series that we offer. And I want to highlight the seminar next month in case you'd like to join. It will be presenters from the Crisis Outreach Response and Engagement Team, otherwise known as CORE, here at CU Anschutz, and it'll feature Amber McDonald, Maeve Winman, and Tosh Petras. So please join us next month. It will be the second Tuesday of the month at noon, just as this one is. So back to the talk for today. I'm excited to welcome our 4 speakers. I'm going to provide very brief introductions and then turn it over to them. The recording from today will be available to everyone registered. The link will be shared and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. If you have questions or comments for discussion during the seminar today, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'll have time, probably 10 to 15 minutes at the end to answer your questions. So our first speaker today will be Sarah Brandspiegel, who is the Director of Outreach for the Injury and Violence Prevention Center. She engages in suicide prevention research, leads outreach and training efforts, and facilitates dissemination of research findings into practice. She also leads our Pathways to Prevention webinar series, so you may recognize her from that. The second speaker will be Leslie Barnard. She's a DRPH student in the epidemiology program. Her previous work is as an epidemiologist in state and local health departments, including various injury and violence prevention programs, specifically firearm injury, suicide, opioid overdose research, surveillance, and response. The next speaker will be Laura Rooney, who is a research coordinator for the University of Washington Harborview Injury Prevention and Research Center in the Firearm Injury and Policy Research Program. And a special thanks to that group for co-hosting the seminar today. Thanks for being collaborators on this. Their program's mission is to reduce the impact of firearm injury and death on people's lives through interdisciplinary research and collaboration with institutional, community, and governmental partners. And our last speaker today will be Jacqueline Clark. She's the founder and co-owner of Bristlecone Shooting, Training, and Retail Center in Lakewood, Colorado, which is a startup family-owned business that's owned and operated by the husband and wife team, Jacqueline and Brian Clark. She's a certified pistol instructor, a certified defensive firearms coach, and an active contributor to the Colorado Firearms Safety Coalition. And with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Sarah to kick us off.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here and excited to be talking about this topic. And it's International Women's Day, so a really special day to have an all-women panel to present on this suicide prevention work. So I'm going to start first by saying that this is the work of a much larger team than is represented here. We've listed the research team from the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Campus, Department of Emergency Medicine and School of Public Health, and also Harborview Injury Prevention and Research Center. We also have a fantastic advisory board for this work, including folks from public health and suicide prevention, as well as the firearms community that help advise on the direction of this research. And just to say, this research is supported by the National Institute of Mental Health. So I'm going to start with some background and rationale for why we're talking about out-of-home firearm storage and how it fits under the sort of broader umbrella of suicide prevention. So you may know that suicide is a leading and growing cause of death in the United States, and that firearms are used in half of all suicides. Most firearm-related deaths are suicides. So we really need to look at firearm injury prevention and suicide as very connected issues. Every day, we lose 64 Americans to firearm suicide. And many of us have personally been affected by suicide loss, and we know the cost for families and communities exceeds anything that you can measure. So it's a very important topic and something that I think a lot of us bring, real personal passion to. We also know that firearms are ubiquitous in this country. 4 in 10 US adults say they live in a household with a gun, and 2020 was a record-setting year for gun sales. So all that to say, we focus on temporary firearm storage away from the home for a few reasons. Primarily lethal means safety, excuse me, which is an effective strategy to prevent suicide. So that means putting time and space between a person at risk of suicide and the method that they might use for suicide. That can give the person the time that they need to recover from those suicidal thoughts. Reducing access can include a whole range of activities. It can mean locking up the firearm in the home, disassembling the firearm, giving it away, selling guns, and also temporarily storing away from the home until that crisis period passes. So besides suicide prevention, there's a lot of other reasons that someone might want to store their firearm away from the home. And we like to bring that in to the conversation as well. That could be traveling, selling a home, maybe children are visiting, maybe a military deployment, circumstances like that as well. And many professional organizations recommend storing firearms away from the home as the safest option when someone is in crisis. So this image on this slide shows a brochure from the New Hampshire Firearm Safety Coalition. And they added an 11th commandment of gun safety. So temporary offsite storage if someone in the household might be suicidal. Also, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the firearm industry trade association, recommends offsite storage as well. And so really, this is an issue where folks from the medical and public health community, the suicide prevention community, and the firearms industry really come together in agreement about the potential for offsite storage during those temporary crisis periods to save lives. When we think about who might be in a position to counsel a family where someone is at risk of suicide, that could include a lot of different people in a community. So that could be medical and behavioral health clinicians, crisis lines, community members, pastors, friends, family, really any of us could be in this situation. And it's in order to be helpful in a scenario like that, we really need viable storage options to recommend. We also, suspect that clinicians might be less likely to bring up firearms if they don't have a recommendation for offsite storage that's really actionable in that moment. So, that's part of the context for this work. Is there concerns that, ad hoc practices like, oh, just store your firearm with a neighbor or family member, that can introduce risk for others. And it can also, in some cases, raise concerns about gun laws and private transfers. So all that to say, our focus is exploring community partners that sort of have the infrastructure in place to support lethal means safety work and can expand the range of available options for someone who's in crisis. So who can provide out-of-home storage? There's a range of different options. It really varies a lot by community. There's some images here of some examples. So friends and family, law enforcement agencies, gun retailers and shooting ranges. Also self-storage facilities will sometimes provide firearm storage, pawn shops. And then there are some specialty businesses that are armories that are particularly designed for this type of thing. They're not super common, but they are available in some communities. And so in terms of like, how common is this? A prior survey led by Carol Runyon found that 48% of firearm retailers and law enforcement agencies in the Mountain West region did offer temporary voluntary storage. And many retailers, about 50%, and more than 50% of law enforcement agencies said that they had had a request for storage in the past year. So in 2019, Colorado developed the first online publicly accessible map of locations willing to consider requests for voluntary temporary firearm storage. So this map included firearm retailers and also law enforcement agencies. And we built it in collaboration with the Colorado Firearms Safety Coalition to help link community members with options that would consider requests for storage. It ended up with over 60 options around the state identified, and the map is still live and accessible. There's a link here if you want to check it out. I think it's important to mention that we didn't dictate in building this map what the storage programs would actually look like. It's really up to each business and agency to determine their own policies and procedures. Things like whether they charge for storage, if they have a limit on the number of firearms that they're willing to store, that sort of thing. We were aiming to provide a connection so someone looking for storage options in their area could quickly find some places to call. And we also published a brief summary of this work led by Ty Kelly to share what we learned along the way. And we're always happy to chat with anyone who's interested in doing this type of work in another state. Since then, other maps have been developed in several different states. Many also use Google Maps, but there's also an example here from New York, which has a firearm storage map with 188 locations. And they created their map in Tableau. And we also know that there's additional maps either in consideration or in progress of being built in other places. So with all that as background, we wanted to learn more through this research project about the firearm storage maps and about temporary storage options across the country. And that was the context for what we're discussing today. So I'm going to now turn it over to Leslie Bernard to talk a bit about the research methods and preliminary results.
Thank you, Sarah. Awesome. So we can go ahead and jump right into our research methods. Next slide, perfect. So we used qualitative methods to examine the availability of temporary firearm storage to prevent suicide. This included examining barriers, facilitators, opinions, and opportunities to improve access to out-of-home firearm storage. Next slide. We conducted semi-structured qualitative interviews with stakeholders, including firearm retailers and ranges, law enforcement agencies, other public health and firearm organizations in Colorado and Washington State. We recorded, transcribed, and coded these interviews using Deduce to facilitate a team approach. And our transcripts were coded using a mixed inductive and deductive approach. Next slide, please. So here are some of our preliminary results. We conducted qualitative interviews with 100 individuals from each of our partner groups, including retailers and ranges, law enforcement agencies, and other organizations from October of 2020 to May of 2021. And interestingly, because we had 100 participants, the N on the right column is also the percentage reported. So as you can see, we mostly most of the people we interviewed represented in the age group 35 to 54 years of age, were mostly male and mostly white. About 30% of our participants were retailers and ranges, about 20% were law enforcement organizations, and the remaining half were various organizations, including firearm rights, firearm retailers, and firearm training organizations, in addition to public health suicide prevention and firearm injury prevention or administrative and legislative organizations. Next slide. So our analysis of the qualitative interviews identified specific themes related to providing temporary storage. The first theme was a desire to help customers and the community. The second was liability, legal, regulatory, and logistical concerns. And the third was strategies to increase access to community-based storage. And we also described the differences between priorities of firearm businesses and law enforcement agencies. Next slide. Retailers and ranges reported as a desire to help customers in the community represented by these quotes here. And I'll just read two of them. So if you could save a life, wouldn't you want to? If you saw someone drowning, wouldn't you grab him? Another retailer said, just another community service. I mean, yes, we sell guns, but we also want to make sure that they're in safe hands. Next slide. So there were also concerns raised by firearm retailers about the legality of storage and whether it was questioned by someone other than the firearm or requested by someone other than the firearm owner. So one firearm retailer said, well, I think it all comes down to liability. Storage locations would definitely need liability protection and probably some guidance as to when they can return firearms to somebody. Next slide. Most law enforcement officers we spoke to saw the appeal and the benefit of providing firearm storage. It's important to note that while most law enforcement agencies we spoke with are in some capacity able to accept firearms in times of crisis, law enforcement may not be the first storage choice of some gun owners. Mistrust of law enforcement has been discussed among various members of the public in recent years, especially when it comes to matters involving mental health crises and fear of losing firearms, as well as firearm rights. So we heard several firearm owners, as well as public health groups and firearm rights groups echo this sentiment. But in reflecting the desire to help, one quote from a law enforcement agency was, "This is essentially one more form of providing first aid to our community." Next slide. Awesome. Many officers elaborated on the barriers to offering temporary storage, pointing out logistical concerns, as well as concerns over having people, especially people experiencing a crisis, bringing in a firearm to a public setting, like a police agency. They also varied in their desire to participate in the map or even publicize the service to provide firearm storage at all. Many spoke about how they would never deny storing someone's firearms in a situation where they were experiencing a crisis, but didn't want the temporary storage to be viewed as a regular service that they could offer. In this, there were concerns about space for storage, as well as returning the firearm back to the person after their crisis, and an overall feeling that this wasn't the traditional role of law enforcement. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read this slide, but as Sarah just said, we'll share the slides so that you guys will have access to, you all will have access to these quotes. Next slide. Here's a quote that highlights community trust as a priority. So it needs to be really clear that there is absolutely no connection between this and red flag laws being extreme risk protection orders that exist both in Colorado and Washington state. As well as, I believe, 19 other states and the District of Columbia, so that there's no crossover of information so that people can trust this. That's really a voluntary thing and it's not going to turn into something else. Next slide. The biggest concern for both firearm ranges and retailers and law enforcement agencies was liability during storage and upon return. Here's a quote that highlights that. So storage is absolutely something that we need to do. I just would like some confidence to know that when I'm doing it, that I'm doing it in the right way, that I'm not going to get legal ramification or even a newspaper article if a person went and told them that he was going to commit suicide and they gave his gun back to him. I mean, that story alone is devastating. And that's it for our preliminary results. And I'm going to hand it over to Lauren.
Lovely. So my name is Lauren Rooney, and I'll be discussing some of the discussion recommendations based on what we just heard. So some of the limitations of this project include that they only heard from Washington and Colorado participants, especially when it comes to the law enforcement agencies and retailers. While we were able to speak with other firearm groups and public health groups in other states, the perspective of the potential suppliers mostly came from the two states of Washington and Colorado. And we also are aware that participation was likely biased towards support of voluntary temporary storage. We were not able to speak with people who were adamantly against it at this time. Next slide. So through the, excuse me. So throughout the interviews, there were questions on whether or not background checks would be required when returning a firearm to the owners, other issues in terms of whether or not a firearm range or a retailer would be within their rights to refuse to return a firearm to someone who they would be concerned about. And there were also a number of laws that need to be addressed through clarification, expectations, or ATF regulations. These are all things that came up in various interviews throughout the entire process. Through a large portion of the interviews, there was also a large concern over liability of returning a firearm, and should a subsequent suicide or other incident occur, what would happen to the person who returned the firearm. This might require a look into some new policies in order to address this specifically, including but not limited to, again, current different laws, expectations, or messaging from the ATF themselves. It's clear throughout this that while many locations really do want to provide storage to help their communities, there are specific challenges, especially related to liability, that might limit broader participation by other firearm ranges and retailers specifically, and may require some more creative strategies in order to address them. Next slide. So here are some examples of some storage options. What we learned throughout building our map as well, in calling them, get to the point. Ask them if they provide temporary voluntary storage directly. If yes, share a little bit more about why you would be calling, explaining that this is a map that we're putting together. We're looking to create a tool that will allow the community members to see where they can store their firearms in times of crisis more readily. There are also many legal issues of concern. It was helpful to have contact information for an ATF agent that was aware of our project and could answer some of our specific questions from shop owners. So we recommend that people, if looking to do this, having contact at the ATF. We found in both states that Google Maps was the best source for brick and mortar retailers. If they have a web presence, they're more likely to be responsive and willing to participate. That being said, Google Maps isn't a perfect tool and would still require a lot of redundant searches and changing from the viewing frame. We also found it was important to not hesitate to mention the word suicide. Gun shop owners tend to be more receptive to potential reasons for temporary gun storage that explicitly involve suicide prevention than other potential reasons for gun storage, such as travel, vacation, moving, just not wanting to get in the house for a little bit. We found that mentioning suicide specifically it motivated people to be involved more. In addition to gun shops and law enforcement agencies, we also recommend consider searching for companies that specialize in temporary voluntary storage, such as private safe deposit box companies, potentially storage facilities, or other places that might be more designed to take quantity to store firearms. And above all else, there are storage options out there. We have an option for additional businesses and agencies to add listed to going forward too. So both of our maps are growing all the time and we see as live documents. Next slide. We recognize that in the future, we will need to clarify complex legal landscape to gun stores, law enforcement agencies, and healthcare providers, as well as community members. It is clear that the legal understanding is not universal, and this might include future messaging for everyone in the future. We also recognize that there's a need for information to come from trusted sources to address legal and liability concern. This may include having multiple trusted resources to communicate to different people, recognizing that different organizations and entities might trust different organizations and entities. We also recommend that working with the ATF, we also recognize that working with the ATF to help clarify for retailers what the process is may help small businesses and firearm retailers be able to offer this service a little more comfortably. We also want to look more into how we can streamline this process for families in crisis or people in crisis, by looking at things such as logistics for pickup, how to return, timelines, and things like that. We also need to look more into gun owners' preferences, their trusted messengers, and acceptability of interventions in promoting out-of-home storage. We also need to research to understand responses to different approaches. This might look like trying out different messages and storage options to families in crisis and individuals themselves, as well as clinicians. We also see that there are URPO laws being passed around the country, and this might drive a need for more storage, but also might complicate the understanding of temporary voluntary out-of-home storage. As those URPOs are similar in nature, they also have more of a legal backing and might make things more confusing for people seeking out-of-home storage. And with that, I will go ahead and pass this along to Jacqueline.
Hello, thank you so much. I was asked to join as a panelist to share our perspective as a retailer and give you some examples of what we see as kind of a feet on the street example of a facility that offers temporary storage to the community, as well as talk about some of the challenges that we face and concerns, which are very similar at an operational level to what these ladies have already shared through the research findings, concerns about liability and regulation from the ATF. So as far as our perspective as a retailer, we offer temporary storage, and we offer it in one of two available ways to a facility like ours. For us, the temporarily stored firearms are stored with the rest of our inventory, just in a separate section in the back. They are not locked up in lockers like you saw in that one picture from Centennial Gun Club. That's the second way that facilities like ours are able to provide storage. We do have lockers at our facility, but we have so many members that rent them on an annual basis. We don't have any that are available for temporary storage that we keep open. So we store anybody who decides to store a firearm with us. It's stored with the rest of our inventory in a locked place in the facility in the back, where our inventory goes when we close down at night. We lock everything in the back. Because we choose to do it that way, or that's the way we, I guess, have to do it because we don't have the space to do it the second way. We do require that customers who are using our temporary storage service to complete a background check when they are returned. So per the way the ATF views temporary storage at a facility like this is that if it is locked up and the facility doesn't have access to a locker, for example, like you saw in that picture, and the customer is the only one that has keys, the facility keeps an inventory of what's in there, but they don't go on our ATF records as a firearm taken in and then being disposed of back to a customer or to a different person. So there's no prerequisite for a background check. The way that we facilitate the storage, there is a required background check in order to return the firearm. We see people storing firearms at our facility for a myriad of reasons. We set up the program to help the community as a public service for people that are in a state of mental crisis and may want to store their firearms for a short period of time until the crisis passes. However, in practice, we get a much higher volume of people storing them for random reasons. Their grandkids are visiting for the summer and they don't have a way to lock up the firearms in the house. We've had a number of large estates where there are multiple firearms and somebody inherits them and they don't know what to do with them. And so they need to store them for a while because they know they'll be safe here. We have had a number of people store them because of mental crisis, and that's why the program was set up. But the reasons are a lot more broad than I would have thought when we originally started with the program. So again, to kind of review the two different ways that a facility like this can provide storage. The way that we do it, we do require a background check when the person comes in to pick up the firearm. And because we require that, or have to require that background check on the back end, on the front end, the customer does have to fill out a form and certify that they are the owner of the firearm. They can't bring in firearms that belong to somebody else that maybe they don't have permission to bring in to be stored here. They have to give an inventory of what's being stored and the condition that it's coming in. We don't accept any firearms that aren't compliant with Colorado law. So there's a whole list of things that they have to certify and verify when they bring it in. And then we will store the firearms. Our agreement says up to 90 days just because we needed to put some sort of time frame on it. But we have made plenty of exceptions outside of that 90-day time period for people that need to store them longer. The second way that a facility can offer storage like this is through a locker system. So if they happen to have lockers that are available or a dedicated, place where the customer can store a firearm, it's locked, kind of like a public storage facility, and the dealer has no access to those firearms, then there's no requirement for a background check on the ending side of the storage agreement. I think somebody asked a question in the chat about whether or not that background check deters people from storing firearms, and I would say yes, it does. I wish we had the ability at our facility to store them in our member lockers, but we don't. It would be a substantial capital investment to build additional lockers or create space in the first place to even build them. So we have to, the way that we're set up, store them with the rest of the firearms industry or firearms inventory, and then we have to require a background check. So yeah, I do think that's a deterrent, but for us, unfortunately, there's not a way to get around it because of the ATF regulation. Changes to make to storage agreements that would make it more feasible for customers. I think the background check would absolutely be one. If I was concerned about mental health or in a hurry, or it might seem like just an extra step to go through with the background check, but it does protect dealers to a certain extent. So that's the flip side. I don't have to worry as much about somebody storing guns here to try to get out of a ERPO situation, because I know that the background check on the backside is going to pull up anything related to an ERPO, and then we wouldn't return the firearm. So the documents that the customers sign on the front end acknowledge that they know when they leave the guns here, there is going to be a background check upon returning it. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. Another thing I was asked to kind of think about in preparation for this would be recommendations for other storage locations that, again, would make it easier for people and family members that are looking for a temporary storage option outside the home. If I think about the community a community that's really affected by suicide, it's a veterans community. And so I think maybe creating pathways for places like American Legion posts to have some sort of way to store firearms. And I don't think they would need storage in the volume that we would have to have it, but a few lockers that would enable them to store it in a locked way where they wouldn't have to deal with the ATF regulation would be helpful. So places like that have a strong connection to communities that are affected would be a great way to create some pathways to make this easier for the community. Challenges that dealers like we face, I think their research findings hit it on the head. I mean, most dealers, and we're included in this, worry a lot about liability and regulation. When the ATF comes in to audit a facility, and we just had an audit back in the fall, there's no forewarning and there's really no forgiveness because you're trying to do the right thing. If your books are not the way that they need to be, reflecting the firearms that are in the facility, whether they're inventory for sale, whether they're guns in the gunsmith shop, whether they're temporary storage, if it's not reflected correctly or handled correctly from a transaction standpoint, you could lose your license. So dealers, when they all want to do the right thing, they all want to make sure that they're not selling firearms to people that might be in a state of mental crisis, or returning them after a storage agreement to people that might be in a state of mental crisis. They also are faced with this heavy regulatory burden. If they're not reflecting things the right way for each transaction, they're not going to be doing business in the first place. And going after the ATF for further clarity around safe storage, I think would make a whole lot of dealers feel a whole lot more comfortable, because if they're able to make it more obvious as far as how dealers can set up a safe storage program, how they should deal with these records on their acquisition and disposition book, it would make people feel better. The second piece of it, the liability, I think I agree would need to be dealt with at the policymaker level. Some sort of safe harbor situation for dealers. The way that we deal with it operationally without any of that in place is the same way we deal with a sale. Our staff has to make a decision about whether or not to give a firearm to somebody in a sale transaction based on the conversation that they're having outside of the background check. But if they don't feel comfortable with somebody's perceived mental state the day that they come in to purchase a firearm, we're not going through with that sale. And it's the same thing at the end of a temporary storage agreement. I'm happy to take questions about any of the operations as well.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I can help try to consolidate because there are a few questions coming in. I want to kind of combine two of the questions that both get at burden and cost, so kind of the logistics, practical aspect. Could you speak a little bit more about sort of the cost, both in terms of time and financially for the client coming in who may want to store, and also the extent to which it's a cost or burden for your business, or is it cost neutral, or is there potentially even, a marketplace opportunity here that this is a service that's undersupplied, and there could be a potential that it could, maybe be cost neutral or even be profitable to provide this service?
Yeah, so I can give you a feel for our cost structure. When we created the program and put a price on it, it's not a area of our business that we're trying to make a big profit off of, but we do attach a cost to it for the customer because there are things that we spend money on to keep those firearms here. So we charge our customers a $25 processing fee to intake a firearm or a group of firearms. It's just a one-time fee when you drop them off, and then $50 for the first firearm and $10 for each additional. And that's for a 3-month period of time. So it's not much money, but we do have to account for all of the compliance personnel and work that we maintain on a regular basis to self-audit, keep correct records, as well as the cost to just have firearms at a facility like this. Our security is crazy in here because of our regular inventory, and then any storage firearms that we have on the premises too, and that's reflected in our insurance premiums, security system, all of that. So those are the costs to the dealer. And some dealers spend more or less on their compliance efforts and security, but all of them do have those two things, and those would be the costs associated with it.
Yeah, and then thinking about two other questions that came in, could you talk through a little bit more what happens when the firearm is returned? Is there something that the customer signs? What might happen if, in fact, the background check isn't passed at that time that the person has come to retrieve the firearm?
Good question. So when they come to take back the firearm, for us, it's the same as a consignment return transaction. So we have a consignment program here, and people can drop off their firearm to try to sell it using our customer base. Sometimes it doesn't sell, they come and take it back. So it's a very similar type of transaction for our retail staff. They have to sit down and complete the federal form 4473, which is a questionnaire. It's electronic at our facilities. Some facilities use paper, and they have to answer a series of questions that would preclude them from getting the firearm back. Are they a habitual user of marijuana? Do they have any felonies on their record? Domestic violence. It goes through a bunch of questions, and then they have to certify some other information about, where they live, et cetera. They have to have the right identification that matches what they're entering on that form. So if they have a Colorado driver's license with an address on the front, but they've moved, and then that address is no longer current, they have to bring in a backup piece of documentation like a car registration to verify their address. And then we enter them into CBI's background check system. In Colorado, it's an instant check, so there's no waiting period that's mandated by the state in Colorado. So the length of time between when our staff enters them into the background check system and they get a result is completely dependent on how many people happen to be buying a firearm at that moment in Colorado. So if somebody comes in on Black Friday to retrieve a temporary storage firearm, they might wait a couple of days for that background check result, and we don't release the firearm until we have approved. If the background check, let me back up. If the 4473 document comes back and our staff reviews it and there's a red flag, we don't release the firearm. So if somebody says, yes, I'm a habitual user of marijuana, or yes, I have a domestic violence something in my background, we don't release it. And a lot of times we don't even put them into the background check system because we know some of those things will kick back a denied. And if the background check comes back from CBI denied, then we don't release the firearm. CBI doesn't tell us why, which is kind of good because I wouldn't want to get into it with the customer, and argue about something they think is expunged, but it's really not. So our staff has kind of a script that they read that says they're not getting this today. Yeah.
And a lot of questions in the Q&A, so that's fantastic. So, and we have time, I think, to get to all of them. The next question, maybe for Jacqueline, based on your experience or any of the panelists today, about, it was mentioned that there's a lot of reasons, maybe more than was anticipated entering into this project, about why people would want temporary storage. But could you speak to what is known about sort of these reasons, and to what extent mental health reasons are making up, what proportion? And it also sounds like it really depends on the solutions. There are different solutions available for storage based on the reasons. And so kind of the extent to which, where the demand is coming from for these solutions.
So that's a hard question to answer, because I think the people that are not having a mental health crisis are very voluntary about why they're storing the guns. I need to store these handguns because my grandkids are spending the summer with us. We do get a number of temporary storage agreements and inquiries from people that don't volunteer why they're doing it. And we actually instruct our staff not to ask a whole lot of questions, because that neutralizes the transaction, and we're able to make we're able to treat it more like a regular firearms transaction on the back end, where, our staff is good at looking for red flags and signs through a conversation that, as a dealer, we may not be willing to return a firearm. If the staff knows that somebody dropped it off 2 weeks ago because they were in a state of mental crisis, they're not necessarily qualified to evaluate that person's mental state, if they're not throwing up any red flags when they come back to get the firearm. And then it brings up that whole question that every dealer has an issue with. Who are we to make the decision about whether or not your state of mental crisis is passed? It's your property at the end of the day, and then for a dealer, we get into the whole bailment law. If I refuse to give back, if I refuse to sell somebody a firearm, that's one thing, because it's my property. If I haven't made the transfer, I may have taken the person's money, but I can return the money. But it's my property until it walks out the door. These temporary storage firearms, they're somebody else's property. And so that's a really sticky situation where I could anticipate having to get some lawyers involved if something went south. At the end of the day, my facility and staff would never hand over a firearm, regardless of whose it was, if the person was an obvious risk. But that person, if it's really their gun and I'm just storing it, that could be kind of a legal question, and then the dealer's like, well, I'm really just doing this as a community service, trying to spend lots of money on legal fees, etc. Yeah.
Well, it seems like the elephant in the room here really is this these policy and legal issues that reach all the way up to the federal level with the ATF. And from any of the panelists, I'm wondering about your optimism that there may be the sort of guidance that you've been alluding to, or that these things will change. And if not, where do you see the opportunities for creative solutions and workarounds, in the meantime?
Yeah, it's a big question. I will say that we have been working to share some of these results with the ATF to make sure they understand that there is this confusion, and that people don't, depending on the different retailers have different understandings of what the regulations are. And we've even heard that different ATF agents may have different interpretations of how the regulations apply to this type of voluntary storage. And they are working to try to issue some sort of clarification of that, which I think will be very simple and straightforward, but we'll just explain, what the process is for a retailer that wants to store in this manner. So we're hopeful that will help. That's only a piece of it. There are the bigger policy issues that kind of go beyond the ATF's implementation of existing regulations. And I know there's been interest from policymakers. I guess I would say I am optimistic just because of the focus on mental health issues and suicide prevention that we're going to see some changes in this area. But I think it's also really important to make sure that changes are done in a way that draws a distinction between court-ordered storage and voluntary storage, and that maintains trust with people who are, in the firearms community who might be seeking storage, so that it doesn't kind of muddy the waters about whether this is about gun control or something like that. For policies to be effective, I think they need to happen in that kind of broader context. I don't know if others want to weigh in.
Well, it seems like, or following up on a question from Katie, or a comment about some opportunities to, add to a toolkit in terms of models for scripts and storage. What are your plans, anyone on this team for next steps in terms of greater, publicity for these, solutions, and yeah, what's next?
So I can say that the next phase of this research project is talking to other states who have started the mapping program. So looking at, as Colorado sort of as a model, looking at the ways that, or the areas that you can store your firearm that are available to people. I will say that is less about approaching retailers and ranges and law enforcement with the exact process that they should use. We're really trying to leave that up to those particular businesses and organizations. We don't want to tell them how to run sort of what they know how to do already. So I don't think that is the biggest focus of this next phase, rather than helping states figure out how to get these locations out so that firearm owners know who to contact. And then they can go on to contact, if they prefer, perhaps a law enforcement organization to a retailer range, or vice versa, and sort of make the decision on their own once they know what's available to them.
I think I'm working my way through the questions in the chat. So if I've missed a burning question, please rechat it. Are there circumstances where someone other than the firearm owner can store the weapon?
I can answer that. And the way that we facilitate storage now, they have to sign that, like an affidavit when they drop it off, saying that it's theirs. And again, that kind of keeps us safe, because in a scenario where I'm a family member, and let's say my brother has a bunch of guns, and maybe I'm not a gun person and he seems to be acting a little erratic lately, and I just take him away and take him down to the gun store. If I don't have a way to say, are these yours? You have the ability to drop these off. Angry brother can come down and demand it back. And then we're in the middle of some family squabble that really we're not qualified to make a decision on. So we do require that you at least sign saying that you are the owner when you drop them off. Now, in the second way that facilities like this facilitate storage, not necessarily, because if a facility has lockers that are accessed only by the person that has the key, that person can be putting other people's guns in there, and the dealer or facility wouldn't have a way to check on that, just like a public storage place.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, Jacqueline, when you mentioned about the space limitations at your business, it made me wonder if there is, as maybe customers or the general public learns about this, maybe it hasn't occurred to them to do this out of home storage. during some of these scenarios, maybe the demand is growing. Do you think that the marketplace has the capacity to support the demand? And thinking about the entire marketplace, it's interesting to think about other companies like those that specialize in storage or lock boxes. Have we reached a point where there's so much demand we're just kind of limited on place, or are we not quite there yet, do you think?
I think we could be. I mean, I think if we had the space and the money to invest and build new lockers and we advertised it, I think you could. I think there could be a demand for it because if you think about the Second Amendment community in general, they usually tend to be a little bit more cautious about a lot of things and probably wouldn't explore like a public storage option, but they would go to a trusted partner for a variety of storage reasons, not necessarily always, again, mental health. But yeah, I think it could be a more enterprising scenario. Mm-hmm. And then it would be in the more desirable format without the background check and without the dealer having access. The fees would probably have to be higher. But yeah, that would be a more desirable model, I would think.
Yeah, it seems like, among these situations and where people are looking for out-of-home storage options, and among the different opportunities they have to do that, it seems like the really intractable problem here is when there's a mental health crisis and determining when that crisis has resolved and removing liability of the owner for anything that comes after that. And I'm just kind of curious, I from any of the panelists about, if they could wave their wand, what would really help deal with that? In the chat, there's some mention of the ATF and kind of limitations of those opinions. And so if that's not the solution, where are the other solutions to this particular intractable problem?
Yeah, I think that we've definitely heard that in a lot of the responses from our participants, both in these qualitative interviews that we're reporting on here. And then we should have a paper coming out this spring that's a survey from retailers and ranges, both in Washington and Colorado, that includes information on one of the biggest barriers to providing temporary storage is just liability. So including liability waivers for stores that have this, like sort of like a Good Samaritan type law, so that if anything happens after they return the firearm, that they are completely, there's no liability associated with that. So I think that it's definitely a challenging thing to think about passing, but I think also has great implications in terms of participation for stores and making sure that this is a more widely available sort of program for firearm owners as a resource.
I'll say too that some of the things that have come up in discussion when we were doing these interviews that also spoke to that is kind of what we're doing right now, like information share from retailers to retailers in terms of what have they done that's worked, what have, kind of creating this toolkit and making it kind of a business, facilitating conversations among different businesses who've been in these circumstances and have had luck, have faced their own challenges, and learning this and kind of learning how they would work around some of these things or find ways to accommodate stuff like this without being having any concern for liability.
And I'm realizing that perhaps there's some comments in the chat that aren't available to all the attendees, but just to read something posted by Brett, that in Washington, they worked with the Attorney General to draft language to shield FFLs from liability in a bill that just passed, SHB 1181. So that might be a resource. And I appreciate the level of expertise and knowledge on this topic from the attendees here today. I do want to, Emmy Betts normally moderates these seminars, and we only have a couple minutes left. So I just want to acknowledge if you have any kind of final thoughts, Emmy, feel free to jump in. And there's a few folks who had questions about following up with our speakers today for either sharing of resources or comment on policy statements. So would you all be willing to be contacted by attendees today with follow-up questions. Just thought I'd check.
Yeah, I think our emails are on the next slide. And I'll just say the previous slide of the map is including, as I mentioned, the third phase of this project is looking at other states who have developed maps or who are thinking about developing maps or who don't know about this and want to know more. So if anyone on the call has contacts that they think that we should be talking to, please feel free to forward them to us. I'm more than happy to reach out to all of them.
Great. Thank you. Well, I think we'll end just a couple minutes early today. I want to thank our 4 panelists for sharing your expertise today and sharing this very valuable work, and really appreciate everyone in attendance today for